I never believed my grandmother's warnings about beautiful things forged in blood. Power has a price, little one. She'd whisper while fastening her antique gold pendant around my neck, her eyes distant with memories she refused to share. And love, when tangled with revenge, cuts deeper than any blade. 6 months after her death, I stood in a Viennese cafe, that same pendant cool against my skin, unaware that every step of my life had been orchestrated to bring me face to face with Marco Valenti, heir to the empire that destroyed my family. His espresso accidentally, spilled on his immaculate suit, was the first move in a game decades in the making. 12 hours later, I was in his penthouse, watching as he made a single phone call that altered the trajectory of my life. Within a week, I discovered that my beloved grandmother had been exiled from Italy after her husband, the original head of a powerful crime family, was murdered by Marco's father in a bloody takeover fueled by false accusations of betrayal. The truth should have made me run. Instead, I found myself drawn deeper into a world of luxury and danger, falling for the son of the man who orphaned me, wearing the pendant that could prove my grandfather's innocence. "You're mine," Marco whispered against my skin, his possessiveness both thrilling and terrifying. What he couldn't know was that I had my own agenda, my own need for answers and possibly revenge. When I finally learned the full truth that Marco's father had been manipulated into the murder by the rival Castellano family, my world shattered completely. In my devastation and rage, I made the one choice I knew would destroy Marco as thoroughly as his family had destroyed mine. I gave myself to Vittorio Castellano, the grandson of the man who had engineered my grandfather's downfall. I never imagined the violence that would follow. Never dreamed that Marco's controlled exterior concealed such capacity for brutal retribution. Never understood that in trying to avenge my grandfather's blood, I would spill so much more and be forced to decide if love born in deception and nurtured in vengeance could ever truly heal generations of betrayal. My name is Amber Riley, and this is the story of how an American culinary student became entangled in Italy's most dangerous family legacy, and how a pendant passed through generations led to both bloodshed and redemption. The April rain pounded against the windows of Café Goldner Apfel as I piped the last rosette onto a tray of miniature Black Forest pastries. My fingers were cramped, my white chef's coat splattered with chocolate, and my carefully braided hair now frizzy from the kitchen's humidity. I'd been on my feet for 8 straight hours, and my shift wasn't even over. "Amber, Herr Schmidt's party needs these now." Frau Muller's sharp voice cut through the kitchen chaos. Our cafe manager could make drill sergeants seem relaxed by comparison. Her steel-gray hair was always pulled back in a severe bun, her black attire perpetually unwrinkled despite the hectic environment. "Coming, Frau Muller," I called, carefully transferring the delicate pastries to a silver serving platter. 3 months into my culinary internship in Vienna, and I was still struggling to meet the exacting Austrian standards of perfection. My hand instinctively rose to touch the pendant at my throat, a habit I'd developed since my grandmother's death 6 months ago. The antique gold piece was intricate and unusual, a lion intertwined with what looked like a stylized M, small diamonds creating a subtle sparkle. It was the only real connection I had left to my grandmother, Rose Marino, who had raised me after my parents died in a car accident when I was 4. "Always wear it," she'd told me on her deathbed, pressing the pendant into my palm with surprising strength. "It's more than just jewelry. It's protection. It's your birthright." I'd attributed her cryptic words to the morphine. Now I simply wore it because it made me feel less alone in a foreign country where I knew almost no one. I pushed through the kitchen's swinging doors and entered the cafe's main area, an elegant space of vaulted ceilings, crystal chandeliers, and dark wood furnishings. The Goldener Apfel was famous for serving Vienna's elite, from orchestra conductors to business magnates to the occasional nobility. Today, the cafe was hosting a private gathering, some business meeting that had Frau Muller particularly on edge. "Remember," she'd instructed earlier, "these are important people. Very important. The service must be flawless." I navigated carefully between the tables, the heavy tray balanced precisely as I'd been taught. The guests were gathered in small groups, men in bespoke suits, and women in designer dresses, their conversations a mix of German, English, and Italian that created a sophisticated hum in the air. As I approached the main table to arrange the pastries on the display, I didn't notice the man who stepped back from his conversation. Our collision was brief but catastrophic, my silver tray tilting, an espresso cup from his hand toppling, the dark liquid splashing directly onto his briefcase, and the sleeve of what was clearly an extraordinarily expensive suit. Time seemed to freeze as the room fell silent. I stood mortified, empty tray in hand, staring at the damage I'd caused. "I'm so sorry," I stammered, reaching for my service napkin. "Please, let me." "Don't." The voice was deep, accented, and somehow managed to be commanding without being raised. I looked up to find myself staring into the most penetrating eyes I'd ever seen. Dark amber, almost golden in the cafe's light, set in a face that could have been carved by a Renaissance master. He was taller than me by nearly a foot, his shoulders broad under the ruined suit jacket. Black hair with a touch of silver at the temples was swept back from a face that managed to be both aristocratic and unmistakably dangerous. He wasn't classically handsome, his nose had been broken at some point, his jaw perhaps too sharp, but he was magnetic in a way that made it impossible to look away. For a fraction of a second, his eyes dropped to my pendant, and something flickered in his expression recognition. But it vanished so quickly I thought I might have imagined it. I'll pay for the cleaning," I offered helplessly, knowing my month's salary wouldn't cover the damage to what looked like a handmade Italian suit. A smile touched his lips, though it didn't reach those remarkable eyes. "American," he said, making it a statement rather than a question. "New York?" I blinked in surprise. "Yes. How did you—" "Your accent," he replied simply, setting down his damaged briefcase. "Interesting. I wouldn't have expected to find a New Yorker serving pastries in Vienna." Something about his tone, the casual arrogance, the assumption sparked a flare of defiance through my embarrassment. "I'm not serving," I said, straightening my shoulders. "I'm the one who made them. I'm a culinary student." His eyebrow arched slightly, and he reached past me to take one of the miniature pastries from the tray a colleague had rescued. He examined it for a moment before taking a bite, his eyes never leaving mine. The small act somehow felt more intimate than it should have. "Talented, then," he said after a moment. "The balance of bitter chocolate and cherry is unexpected." Before I could respond, Frau Müller appeared at my side, her face a mask of controlled panic. "Herr Valenti, please accept our deepest apologies. Your jacket, we will of course cover the cleaning. Perhaps we can offer you a private room to freshen up?" Herr Valenti. The name registered dimly in my memory. Frau Müller had mentioned it during the frantic preparations. Something about him being the guest of honor, a potential investor in something. "That won't be necessary," he replied smoothly. "No lasting damage done." His eyes flicked back to me, then once more to my pendant, so briefly I almost missed it. "Your name?" "Amber," I said, finding my voice. "Amber Riley." He nodded once, as if filing the information away. "Marco Valenti. A pleasure despite the circumstances, Miss Riley." Frau Müller's hand closed around my arm like a vice. "Amber, please return to the kitchen. I'll handle this." I nodded, grateful for the escape, and backed away with as much dignity as I could muster. As I retreated, I could feel Marco Valenti's gaze following me, assessing and interested in a way that sent an inexplicable shiver up my spine. In the kitchen, I leaned against the wall, eyes closed, certain my internship was over. Lena, my closest friend among the staff, appeared beside me with a sympathetic grimace. "Of all the suits to ruin," she whispered in her accented English, "you picked Marco Valenti's." "Who is he exactly?" I asked, dreading the answer. Lena's eyes widened. "You don't know? The Valentis own half the luxury fashion houses in Italy. The real ones, not the commercial brands. They're practically fashion royalty." She lowered her voice further. "And they're not just about clothes. There are rumors about how they handle competition, about connections to old Italian families, if you understand me." I did understand, vaguely. My grandmother had occasionally made cryptic remarks about business dealings in Italy that had forced her to leave for America before I was born. But she'd never elaborated, changing the subject whenever I pressed for details. "Great," I muttered. "I've ruined the suit of the fashion mafia. Fashion empire," Lena corrected quickly, glancing around. "Don't even joke about the other thing, not about the Valentis." Before I could respond, Frau Müller burst through the door, her face an unreadable mask. "Amber," she said, her voice clipped. "Herr Valenti's associate will be sending his suit jacket for you to clean personally. Apparently, he doesn't trust our regular service with the fabric." She looked as if this demand was both an imposition and yet somehow a peculiar honor. "Me? But I don't know how to—" "You'll figure it out," Frau Müller cut me off. "And you'll do it perfectly. His driver will deliver it to your address this evening." She handed me a card with an elegant logo, a stylized V, intertwined with what looked like a lion. The symbol bore an unsettling resemblance to my pendant, and I found myself touching the gold piece at my throat. If you damage it further, we're both finished in this city. Understand? I nodded numbly, taking the card. As Frau Müller turned to leave, she paused. One more thing. Herr Valenti specifically asked about your pendant. Wanted to know if it was a family heirloom. My hand closed protectively around the piece. What did you tell him? The truth that I don't make a habit of questioning my employees about their jewelry. She gave me an odd look. Should I have said something else? No, I replied quickly. That was fine. After she left, I stared at the business card in my hand, a sense of foreboding washing over me. First, Marco Valenti had noticed my pendant. Then he'd arranged to have his jacket sent to my apartment. The coincidence felt deliberate, like the opening moves in a game I didn't know I was playing. I fingered the pendant, remembering my grandmother's final words about it. It's more than just jewelry. It's protection. For the first time, I wondered exactly what I needed protection from, and whether it might have something to do with the man whose golden eyes had seemed to recognize a piece of jewelry that had been in my family for generations. The package arrived at my apartment at precisely 8:30 that evening. I'd spent the hours since my shift ended frantically researching how to clean expensive Italian wool without damaging it and stress baking 3 trays of lemon cookies that now filled my tiny studio apartment with their citrus to scent. The entire time, my mind kept returning to Marco Valenti's penetrating gaze, the way his eyes had lingered on my pendant, the calculated nature of our accidental collision. When the doorbell rang, I expected a courier with a simple garment bag. Instead, I opened the door to find a tall, broad-shouldered man with a military-precise haircut and a facial scar that sliced from his left temple to his jaw. His expression suggested smiling wasn't in his job description or his capability. "Miss Riley," he said, his accent thicker than Marco Valenti's had been. "I am Paolo. I bring Signor Valenti's jacket and his instructions." He held out not just a garment bag, but an expensive leather portfolio and a small wooden box with the same stylized V logo I'd seen on the business card. The resemblance to my pendant's design was unmistakable, and a chill ran down my spine. "Instructions?" I echoed, accepting the items with hesitation. I thought I was just cleaning the coffee stain. Paolo's expression didn't change. "The jacket requires special handling. The portfolio contains detailed care instructions from Signor Valenti's personal valet. The box contains the necessary supplies." He glanced past me into my apartment, his eyes scanning the space with practiced efficiency, noting exits, windows, potential weapons or threats. "You live alone," he stated rather than asked. "I have very nosy neighbors," I countered, suddenly aware that I was wearing flour-dusted leggings and an oversized NYU sweatshirt, my hair piled in a messy bun on top of my head. The pendant hung visible against my collarbone. Paolo's eyes fixed on it momentarily, something like recognition flickering in his gaze. Then, with deliberate control, he looked away. "Signor Valenti will call you in 1 hour to ensure you've received everything you need." He handed me a small card with a phone number handwritten on it. "If you require assistance before then, you may reach me at this number." As he turned to leave, I noticed the slight bulge beneath his tailored jacket, the unmistakable outline of a concealed weapon. My blood ran cold. "Wait," I called after him, curiosity overcoming my better judgment. "Why isn't he just sending this to a professional cleaner?" Paolo paused, looking back at me with an unreadable expression. "Signor Valenti believes the person responsible for a mistake should be the one to correct it." His eyes held mine with chilling intensity. "He also believes first impressions are rarely accidents." With that cryptic statement, he disappeared down the hallway, leaving me standing in my doorway, clutching an absurdly expensive suit jacket and feeling like I'd somehow stepped into someone else's life or someone else's trap. Inside, I carefully laid the jacket on my small dining table. The garment was a work of art, charcoal wool so fine it felt like liquid beneath my fingers, with hand-stitched details I could barely see. The coffee stain was prominent on the right sleeve, a dark blot against the perfect fabric. I opened the wooden box to find small bottles of specialized cleaners, several types of brushes, and what appeared to be a hand steamer, all nestled in velvet. The portfolio contained not just cleaning instructions, but a detailed provenance of the suit apparently. It had been hand-tailored in Naples by a master craftsman, whose family had been making suits for 3 generations. But what made my hands tremble was the piece of stationery slipped between the pages, heavy cream paper with the Valenti logo embossed at the top. In a bold, angular hand was written, "The lion pendant you wear has a fascinating history. Perhaps we could discuss it when I call. MV." My grandmother's warnings echoed in my mind, Some beautiful things are forged in blood, little one. I touched the pendant reflexively, wondering how Marco Valenti knew anything about it, and why he cared. My grandmother had told me only that it was a family heirloom, passed down through generations. She'd been evasive about its origins, changing the subject whenever I asked direct questions. My phone rang an hour later, exactly as Paolo had said it would. Unknown number. "Hello?" I answered, trying to sound more composed than I felt. "Miss Riley." Marco Valenti's voice was even more compelling over the phone, low and textured with that slight Italian accent. Something about it suggested dark rooms, silk sheets, and secrets whispered against skin. "I trust Paolo delivered everything safely." "Yes, but Mr. Valenti, this seems excessive for a simple coffee stain." "Marco," he corrected smoothly. "And nothing about Attilio's craftsmanship is simple. Have you begun the cleaning process?" I glanced at the jacket, where I'd already started carefully treating the stain following the instructions. "Yes. I've applied the first solution, and I'm letting it set before the next step." "Good." There was approval in his voice that shouldn't have pleased me as much as it did. "You're being careful with the brushing technique? Too much pressure will damage the fibers." "I'm being gentle," I assured him, wondering why a man who could clearly afford 100 such jackets was so concerned about this one. "I expected nothing less," he said, his voice dropping slightly. "Your hands looked capable from the moment I saw them. Creative. Precise." The observation was oddly intimate, suggesting he'd been studying me before our accidental collision. A shiver ran through me, not entirely from fear. "Your note mentioned my pendant," I said, deciding to address it directly. "How do you know anything about it?" A pause then. "That design is quite distinctive. It belonged to a family with significant influence in Italy once. Before my time. But such things are remembered in certain circles." "It was my grandmother's," I said cautiously. "A family heirloom." "Your grandmother," he repeated thoughtfully. "Rose Marino, wasn't it?" My blood froze. I had never mentioned my grandmother's name. "How do you know that?" "Information is a commodity in my world, Amber. More valuable than the fashion houses and hotels that bear my family's name." His tone remained conversational, but something dangerous lurked beneath it. "When a young woman appears in Vienna wearing the Marino family crest, it naturally piques my interest." The Marino family crest. I stared at the pendant as if seeing it for the first time. "What do you want from me?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Initially, to satisfy my curiosity." His honesty was disarming. "Now that we've met, my interests have expanded." He paused, and I could almost see the calculating look I'd witnessed in the cafe. "I'm hosting a small gathering at my hotel tomorrow evening, the Goldener Schwan on the Ringstrasse, 7 o'clock. I think we have much to discuss about your family's history and mine." The invitation hung in the air between us. Every instinct told me to refuse, to run, to book the next flight back to New York and forget Marco Valenti existed. But beneath the fear was a current of something else: curiosity about my grandmother's past, about the pendant I'd worn unthinkingly for months, about the connection between the Marinos and the Valentis. "And if I don't come?" I asked, testing the waters. His laugh was soft but devoid of humor. "I found that direct conversations are always preferable to alternatives. Paolo can be very persistent when required." The threat was velvet-covered steel. "But I don't think it will come to that. You strike me as a woman with an appetite for truth, Amber Riley. And I'm offering you morsels your grandmother deliberately kept from you. How would you know what my grandmother did or didn't tell me?" "Because Rose Marino left Italy for a reason. The same reason she gave you that pendant, but never explained its significance." His voice softened fractionally. "The same reason she taught you to cook, but never taught you your true heritage." After we hung up, I sat staring at the suit jacket, my mind racing with questions. Marco Valenti knew things about my family, about my grandmother, that I'd never known. The pendant at my throat suddenly felt heavier, weighted with history and significance I'd been blind to. I picked up my phone and called Lena. "I think I'm in trouble," I said, when she answered. "What kind of trouble?" she asked immediately. "The kind where Marco Valenti knows who my grandmother was and wants me to come to his hotel tomorrow night." Her sharp intake of breath told me everything I needed to know about the danger I was facing. "Amber, men like him don't just invite culinary students to private meetings without reason. He says it's about my family, about this pendant." "Then it's even worse than I thought," Lena said gravely. "The Valentis don't discuss family history casually. If he's interested in your connections, there's blood involved somewhere." "Blood?" My grandmother's warnings about beautiful things forged in blood suddenly seemed less metaphorical and more literal. What should I do? Lena was quiet for a long moment. If it were anyone else, I'd say run. But with the Valentis, she sighed. If he wants to find you, he will. At least in a public hotel, there are witnesses. You're not exactly calming my fears here. You shouldn't be calm, she replied bluntly. Marco Valenti has a reputation, Amber. They say when his father died, he eliminated 3 rival business heads in a single night. Nothing was ever proven, of course, but no one crosses the Valentis twice. After we hung up, I returned to cleaning the jacket with trembling hands, the task now seeming like a metaphor for my situation, carefully removing a stain, while trying not to destroy the underlying fabric of my life. Whatever game Marco Valenti was playing, I was clearly a pawn he'd anticipated moving on his board. The question was whether I would follow his choreographed steps, or try to rewrite the rules of a game whose stakes I was only beginning to comprehend. The Goldener Schwan Hotel stood like a palace on Vienna's Ringstrasse, its Belle Epoque facade illuminated against the evening sky. I'd walked past it dozens of times since arriving in Vienna, but had never imagined I'd be entering as anything other than a tourist sneaking a peek at the famous lobby. Yet here I was, clutching my small evening bag as if it were a shield, wearing the only cocktail dress I'd brought to Vienna, a simple black sheath that suddenly seemed woefully inadequate for whatever I was walking into. The pendant lay against my skin, no longer just an heirloom but a symbol whose weight I felt with every breath. This is insane, Lena muttered beside me as we approached the doorman. Despite her misgivings, she'd agreed to accompany me, partly out of curiosity and partly out of fear for my safety. We're about to walk into the lion's den, literally. We're just gathering information, I reminded her, though we both knew it was more complicated than that. 20 minutes, maximum. The doorman directed us to the elevator with a respectful nod after I mentioned Marco Valenti's name, his eyes lingering momentarily on my pendant with an expression I couldn't decipher. As we ascended to the penthouse level, my stomach twisted with a cocktail of fear and anticipation. Remember what we agreed, Lena whispered as the elevator slowed. Stay in public areas. Don't accept drinks you haven't seen poured. And if he starts talking about your grandmother like he knew her personally, run, I finished, attempting a smile that felt more like a grimace. Got it. The elevator doors opened directly into a penthouse foyer. The space beyond was breathtaking. Floor-to-ceiling windows showcased Vienna's glittering skyline, while the interior gleamed with understated luxury. About 20 people mingled throughout the open-concept living area, their quiet conversations accompanied by a pianist playing at a grand piano in the corner. A waiter approached immediately. May I help you, miss? I'm here to see Marco Valenti, I said, my voice steadier than I expected. Amber Riley. Recognition flickered in his eyes, followed by something that looked unsettlingly like pity. Of course, Miss Riley. Signor Valenti mentioned you would be joining us. Please, follow me. As we moved through the gathering, I felt eyes tracking our progress. The guests were a striking collection of beautiful people in expensive clothes, radiating that particular confidence that comes with wealth and influence. But there was something else beneath the polished veneer, a wariness, a watchfulness that reminded me of predators assessing potential threats. Marco stood at the far end of the room near the windows, deep in conversation with a striking woman who shared his golden eyes and sharp features. He wore a dinner jacket in midnight blue that made his shoulders look even broader, his dark hair gleaming under the subtle lighting. When he caught sight of me, he excused himself immediately and moved toward us with fluid grace that somehow managed to be both elegant and menacing. A panther in evening wear. Amber, he said, his voice warm but his eyes coolly assessing. You came. I brought your jacket, I replied, holding out the garment bag like a shield. He accepted it, passing it to a nearby staff member without looking. Perfect work, from what Paolo tells me. But that's not why I invited you. His gaze shifted to Lena, who was doing a poor job of disguising her fear. This is my friend, Lena, I introduced. She works with me at the cafe. Marco extended his hand. A pleasure, Lena. I'm glad Amber didn't come alone. Please, both of you, make yourselves comfortable. Drinks, food, everything is at your disposal. The woman he'd been speaking with approached us, her movements carrying the same predatory grace as his. Marco, darling, aren't you going to introduce me? Her English was perfect with just a hint of Italian musicality. Of course. Amber, Lena, this is my sister, Isabella Valenti. Isabella, this is Amber Riley and her friend Lena. Isabella's gaze was penetrating as it swept over me, lingering on the pendant at my throat. Her perfectly composed expression slipped for just a fraction of a second surprise, followed by something darker. "The pendant," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You actually found a merino." "As I told you," Marco replied, his tone betraying nothing. Isabella recovered quickly, offering a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "How fascinating. And you work at the cafe?" The question was casual, but the intensity behind it was anything but. "I'm a culinary student," I corrected, "on exchange from New York." "Trained by her grandmother," Marco added, the statement carrying weight beyond the simple words. "Rose Marino's techniques live on in her granddaughter's hands." At the mention of my grandmother's name, a hush fell over those close enough to hear. A silver-haired man nearby actually crossed himself, muttering something in Italian I couldn't catch. "Perhaps we should move somewhere more private," Isabella suggested, her eyes darting around at the suddenly interested crowd. Before Marco could respond, another man approached our group, younger than Marco but with the same aura of dangerous privilege. His smile was practiced, his eyes cold and calculating as they moved from Marco to me, lingering on my pendant. "The prodigal returns," he said in Italian, his gaze never leaving my throat, or at least her blood does. Marco's posture shifted subtly, his body angling to place himself partially between me and the newcomer. "Vittorio," he greeted, his tone pleasant but with an underlying edge sharp enough to cut glass. "I wasn't aware you were in Vienna." "Business opportunities arise unexpectedly," Vittorio replied smoothly, switching to English. "Especially when old ghosts resurface." He extended his hand to me. "Vittorio Castellano. And you must be Rosa's granddaughter. The resemblance is striking." I hesitated before taking his hand, disturbed by his familiarity with my grandmother. His grip was warm, but his eyes remained cold, assessing me like a commodity rather than a person. "How did you know my grandmother?" I asked, fighting to keep my voice steady. Vittorio's smile widened. Everyone in certain circles knew of Rosa Marino. His emphasis on my grandmother's maiden name was deliberate. Wife of Antonio Marino. Quite the power couple in their day before tragic circumstances intervened. Marco's hand came to rest at the small of my back. A gesture that could have been protective or possessive, perhaps both. "That's enough reminiscing for now, Vittorio. Amber is still learning about her family history." "Is she?" Vittorio's eyebrows rose in mock surprise. "How controlled of you, Marco, parsing out information in careful doses." Before I could process this exchange, a waiter appeared with a tray of small pastries. I recognized them immediately, miniature versions of a Sicilian specialty my grandmother had taught me to make, with a distinctive blend of ricotta, citrus, and pistachio that was unique to her recipe. "Cassatel di Marino," the waiter announced. "Prepared according to the original recipe as requested." My breath caught. These weren't just similar to my grandmother's recipe, they were identical, down to the particular way the edges were crimped and the specific ratio of ricotta to citrus that had been her secret. "How is this possible?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Marco moved closer, his voice low enough that only I could hear. "Your grandmother wasn't just Rose Riley from Brooklyn. She was Rosa Marino, wife of Antonio Marino, head of one of the most powerful families in Sicily, until his murder in 1975. The room seemed to tilt around me. "Murder? A betrayal from within his organization," Marco continued, his eyes never leaving mine. At least that was the official story. Vittorio's laugh was soft but carried an edge. "Official stories rarely capture the full truth, do they, Marco? Especially when the victors write the history." Isabella shot Vittorio a warning glance before turning to Lena. "Perhaps you'd like to see the terrace view? It's spectacular at night." The dismissal was polite but unmistakable. Lena glanced at me, clearly reluctant to leave me alone. I gave her a small nod. I needed to hear whatever was coming next, and Lena's presence wouldn't protect me if these people meant harm. As Isabella led Lena away, I found myself effectively alone with Marco and Vittorio, two predators circling a shared prize. "That pendant you wear," Vittorio said, his eyes fixed on it, "is more than just jewelry. It's a symbol of power, of legitimacy." His gaze flicked to Marco, "and of succession." "Enough, Vittorio," Marco said, his voice carrying a quiet authority that made several nearby guests step back. "She deserves to know whose son she's standing beside." Vittorio pressed, his smile never wavering. "Whose blood paid for the empire he now controls." My hand closed around the pendant protectively. What is he talking about? Marco's expression remained controlled, but something dangerous flickered in his eyes. "My father, Salvatore Valenti, took control of what had been Marino territory after Antonio's death. The transition was not peaceful, not peaceful. Vittorio echoed with a soft laugh. Such a diplomatic way to describe a bullet to the back of Antonio Marino's head with his wife forced to watch. The room spun slightly as the implications sank in. My grandmother had witnessed her husband's murder, and Marco's father had been responsible. "Why would your father kill my grandfather?" I asked, my voice hollow. Marco's eyes held mine, unflinching. "Because he believed Antonio had betrayed him, sold information to rivals that resulted in the deaths of several Valenti associates." He paused. "My father considered Antonio like a brother. The betrayal was personal." "And was there proof of this betrayal?" I asked, already suspecting the answer. "There appeared to be," Marco said carefully. "At the time." Vittorio moved closer, his voice a confidential murmur. "But appearances can be deceiving, can't they? Especially when certain parties have a vested interest in eliminating competition." His eyes gleamed with malicious enjoyment. The Marino pendant on a Valenti chain, how poetic it would be, almost as if history were trying to correct itself. Marco's hand closed around my arm, his grip firm but not painful. "I think it's time we continued this conversation privately," he said, his tone making it clear this wasn't a suggestion. As he guided me toward a side door, away from the main gathering, I glanced back to see Vittorio watching us, raising his champagne glass in a mock toast, his smile revealing the satisfaction of a man who had just lit a fuse and was waiting for the explosion. Marco led me down a hallway, away from the murmuring crowd and Vittorio's knowing smirk. My mind raced with the fragments I'd just learned. My grandfather, a powerful man murdered by Marco's father. My grandmother, forced to witness her husband's execution. The pendant at my throat, somehow a symbol that had both Marco and Vittorio circling like wolves. He ushered me into what appeared to be a private study, bookshelves lining the walls, a large desk overlooking Vienna's skyline, and leather furniture arranged in a conversational grouping. The door closed behind us with a soft click that sounded like a prison gate in my heightened state. "You're trembling," Marco observed, moving to a sideboard where he poured amber liquid into 2 crystal glasses. "I just learned my grandfather was murdered by your father," I said, my voice unsteady, "and that you've apparently been searching for me. Excuse me if I'm not perfectly composed." He offered me one of the glasses. When I hesitated, he took a deliberate sip from it before extending it again. "If I wanted to harm you, Amber, there are far more efficient methods than poison." I accepted the glass but didn't drink. "Why am I here, really?" Marco didn't immediately answer. Instead, he moved to a painting on the wall, a Venetian landscape, and swung it aside to reveal a wall safe. His fingers moved precisely through the combination, and the safe door opened with a hydraulic hiss. "Your pendant," he said, retrieving a thick folder, "is one of only 3 created for the Marino family. Your grandfather wore one. Your grandmother, the other. And the third," he withdrew a small velvet box from the safe, "was meant for their heir." He opened the box to reveal a pendant identical to mine, though newer, less worn by time. The gold lion intertwined with the stylized M glinted in the room's soft light. "There was a child," he continued, placing the box on the desk between us. "A son, born to Antonio and Rosa Marino, 6 months before Antonio's death. A baby who disappeared the night your grandmother fled Italy." My glass trembled in my hand. "I don't have an uncle." "No," Marco agreed, his eyes never leaving mine. "Because the child wasn't your uncle. The timing doesn't align for that." He paused, waiting for me to make the connection. The realization crashed over me like ice water. "My mother," I whispered. "My mother was that baby." Marco nodded once, sharp and precise. "Maria Antonia Marino, renamed Mary Riley when your grandmother recreated herself in America with falsified documents." He opened the folder, spreading photographs across the desk. My grandmother much younger, holding an infant. My grandfather, a handsome man with my same green eyes, standing proudly beside them. "My mother died in a car accident with my father when I was 4, I said, the familiar story suddenly feeling hollow. "That's why my grandmother raised me." "The car accident was real," Marco confirmed, his voice gentler than I'd heard it yet. "But there's more to the story than you know. Your grandmother didn't just flee Italy because of your grandfather's death. She ran because she knew your mother would be hunted the last Marino blood, heir to territories and power the Valentis had claimed." "Then why are you telling me this?" I demanded, setting down the untouched drink with a sharp click. "If your family murdered my grandfather and drove my grandmother into exile, why reveal any of this to me now?" Marco's expression remained controlled, but something like regret flickered in his eyes. Because 30 years ago, evidence emerged, suggesting my father had been manipulated. That Antonio Marino never betrayed anyone he was framed. By whom? The Castellano family, Marco said, his jaw tightening. Vittorio's grandfather orchestrated an elaborate deception, planting evidence, bribing witnesses. He wanted both the Marinos and Valentis weakened, fighting each other while he consolidated power. I sank into the nearest chair, the weight of history pressing down on me. And your father? Did he learn the truth? A shadow crossed Marco's face. He discovered it 6 months before his death. The realization that he'd murdered his closest friend based on lies. He paused. It destroyed him. He became obsessed with finding Rosa and her child, your mother, to make amends. But he never found them. No. Your grandmother was thorough in erasing their tracks. Marco sat across from me, leaning forward slightly. I've spent the past 5 years completing my father's search. When facial recognition software matched your passport photo to Antonio Marino's features in our family archives, I knew I'd found his granddaughter. The calculated nature of our meeting in the cafe now made perfect sense. You spilled that coffee deliberately. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. I needed confirmation. Seeing the pendant, Antonio's pendant around your neck, provided it. Why not just approach me directly? Why this elaborate game? Marco's eyes hardened slightly. Because the same dangers that threatened your mother now threaten you. The Marino bloodline still carries weight in certain circles. There are those who would use you or eliminate you to prevent any challenge to current power structures. People like Vittorio Castellano. Exactly like Vittorio. Marco stood, moving to a window that overlooked the glittering city. He's been watching you since you arrived in Vienna, though he didn't know your significance until tonight. A chill ran through me. And you? What do you want from me? Marco turned, his expression more open than I'd seen it yet. Initially, to right a historic wrong. To acknowledge the debt my family owes yours. He paused. Now, my motivations have evolved. The way his eyes traced my features made my skin flush despite the gravity of our conversation. There was hunger there, but something else too, a recognition. As if he were seeing someone else superimposed over my face. I'm not just Antonio Marino's granddaughter to you, am I? I asked, the realization dawning. I'm some kind of symbol. Redemption for your father's sins. His laugh was short and without humor. Perhaps. But you're also remarkably yourself, Amber. Your strength, your adaptability, facing uncomfortable truths. These are qualities I admire regardless of your bloodline. From the inner pocket of his jacket, Marco withdrew an envelope, aged and slightly yellowed. Your grandmother left this with a lawyer in Rome before she fled. It was to be delivered to Antonio's child on their 25th birthday. But by then, your mother had disappeared completely. The lawyer gave it to my father after he discovered the truth about Antonio's innocence. I took the envelope with trembling hands, recognizing my grandmother's handwriting. For my daughter, when she is ready for the truth. My mother never saw this. No, and it seems fitting that you should read it now. He moved toward the door. Take your time. I'll make your excuses to your friend. Marco, I called, stopping him. Why show me all this? What do you gain? He turned back, his expression unreadable. Perhaps I'm more like my father than I care to admit, haunted by ghosts, seeking absolution. His eyes dropped to my pendant. Or perhaps I recognize that your birthright was stolen by my family and some debts must be paid. As the door closed behind him, I sat alone with the envelope and the weight of revelations that had transformed me from an ordinary culinary student into the heir of a legacy written in blood. With unsteady fingers, I broke the seal and unfolded my grandmother's letter, her familiar handwriting blurring through my tears. My dearest daughter, if you are reading this, then I am either gone or circumstances have forced this truth upon you. You are not simply Mary Riley. You were born Maria Antonia Marino, daughter of Antonio Marino, the most honorable man I have ever known, despite the world he commanded. The threshold I now stood upon wasn't just about entering Marco's world, it was about discovering that I had been born into a world of power and danger that had been hidden from me my entire life. A world that had claimed my grandparents, possibly my parents, and now reached for me, with both Marco's careful manipulations and Vittorio's predatory interest. The pendant at my throat no longer felt like a sentimental connection to my grandmother. It felt like a target or a crown that I'd been wearing unknowingly all this time. 3 days after the revelation at the Goldner Schwan, I found myself in the passenger seat of a sleek black Maserati, Marco Valenti beside me, as we wound through the Alpine roads outside Vienna. My grandmother's letter was folded carefully in my handbag, its contents having permanently altered the foundation of who I believed myself to be. The letter had detailed not only my grandfather's power as head of the Marino family, but my grandmother's role as his confidant and strategist. She wrote of the respect Antonio commanded, not through violence but through an intricate network of loyalty and mutual protection that had made him both beloved and feared throughout Sicily. Salvatore Valenti was his brother in all but blood, she had written, which made his betrayal all the more devastating. If you're reading this, it means a Valenti has found you. Be careful, my darling. Their guilt may appear as generosity, but never forget that power is what they truly serve. Yet here I was, voluntarily accompanying Marco to what he had described as a more secure location after Vittorio Castellano had been spotted outside my apartment building the previous evening. The surveillance had escalated from disturbing to threatening, and when Marco had appeared at my door with Paolo and 2 other security personnel, escape had seemed the only sensible option. "You're quiet," Marco observed, his eyes briefly leaving the road to study my profile. "I'm processing," I replied, watching the countryside blur past. 3 days ago, I was a culinary student with a dead grandmother and ordinary ambitions. Now I'm apparently the heir to a Sicilian crime family, being driven to a safe house by the son of the man who murdered my grandfather. A ghost of a smile touched Marco's lips. "When you say it like that, it does sound rather operatic." "It's my life, not an opera," I said sharply. His expression sobered. "You're right. Forgive me." He returned his attention to the winding road. "For what it's worth, I meant what I said at the hotel. My father's actions based on Castellano's deception or not created a debt that can never truly be repaid. But I am trying to protect you now. From Vittorio or from the truth?" Marco's hands tightened fractionally on the steering wheel. "Both, perhaps. Vittorio sees you as a way to finally destroy what remains of both our families. As for the truth," he paused, "some revelations are better administered in measured doses." The implication that he was still withholding information sent a chill through me. "More family secrets? Family complications," he corrected, turning the car onto a private road that curved upward into the forested mountainside. "We're almost there." There turned out to be a modernist structure of glass and stone that seemed to grow organically from the mountainside. Nestled among pine trees with a commanding view of the valley below, it projected both luxury and impregnability, the perfect balance of beauty and security that seemed to characterize everything in Marco's world. As we pulled into the covered garage, I noted the discreet but unmistakable security features: cameras concealed in architectural elements, reinforced doors, bulletproof glass. This wasn't just a retreat, it was a fortress. Inside, the stark exterior gave way to warm, sophisticated interiors. Artwork that belonged in museums hung casually on walls. Furniture that combined aesthetics and comfort filled the open-plan living areas. Floor-to-ceiling windows showcased breathtaking alpine vistas while somehow maintaining complete privacy from the outside world. "My sister's design," Marco explained as he led me through the space. "Isabella has a gift for creating environments that feel both welcoming and defensible." "Is that the Valenti family motto?" I asked, only half joking. "Welcoming but defensible?" He actually laughed at that, a genuine sound that transformed his usually guarded features. "It might as well be." He gestured toward a hallway. "Your suite is this way. I had some clothes and necessities brought for you, but if there's anything specific you need, Paolo can arrange it." The suite was larger than my entire apartment in Vienna, a bedroom with a king-sized bed, a sitting area with its own fireplace, a marble bathroom with a soaking tub that could easily fit 2 people, and a private balcony overlooking the mountains. The closet had been stocked with clothing in my size, from casual wear to evening dresses, all with designer labels I normally wouldn't dare even touch in stores. "This is too much," I said, running my fingers over a cashmere sweater that probably cost more than a month's rent. "It's the minimum required for your position," Marco replied, watching me from the doorway with an intensity that made my skin prickle. "My position? As Antonio Marino's granddaughter. As the legitimate heir to territories and businesses that have been operating under alternative management since his death." I turned to face him fully. "Are you suggesting I have some claim to what your family took after my grandfather was killed?" Marco's expression remained carefully neutral. "I'm acknowledging that by blood and tradition, certain operations rightfully belong under Marino control. Whether you choose to claim that inheritance is another matter entirely. The casual way he referenced what was clearly criminal enterprise should have horrified me. Instead, I felt an unexpected thrill, a sense of possibility I'd never experienced in my carefully constructed ordinary life. And if I did choose to claim it? I asked, testing the waters. Something darkened in Marco's eyes, approval mixed with something more primal. Then you would need guidance, protection, allies who understand the complexities of the world you'd be entering. Allies like you, precisely like me. He stepped into the room, closing the distance between us with deliberate slowness. Our families were strongest when united, Amber. The Marinos with their loyalty networks and strategic brilliance, the Valentis with their business acumen and tactical execution. His proximity was intoxicating, the subtle scent of his cologne, the heat radiating from his body, the intensity of his gaze as it held mine. For a moment I thought he might reach for me, and part of me wanted him to. Instead, he maintained a careful distance, respecting boundaries while making his interest unmistakable. "This isn't just about business for you, is it?" I asked quietly. Marco's smile was razor sharp. Few things worth having are ever about just one thing. He stepped back slightly. "Rest. Change. When you're ready, join me downstairs. There's someone you should meet, someone who knew both your grandfather and my father during those final days." After he left, I moved to the window, staring out at the mountains while my fingers instinctively found the pendant at my throat. The merino lion. My birthright, if Marco was to be believed. In my reflection on the glass, I searched for traces of the man in the photographs, my grandfather Antonio Marino, whose blood ran in my veins and whose enemies and allies now circled me like sharks sensing blood in the water. My grandmother's warning echoed in my mind. Their guilt may appear as generosity, but never forget that power is what they truly serve. Blas. Dodd. Yet as I changed into clothes provided by Marco, a simple but exquisitely tailored black dress that fit as if made for me, I couldn't help wondering if power might be something I could learn to serve as well. If the dormant merino blood in me might be waking to possibilities I'd never considered. The pendant caught the light as I fastened a delicate gold chain around my neck, the lion's eyes seeming to glow with approval. For the first time, I felt not just connection to this symbol, but ownership of it and all it represented. I was entering Marco Valenti's world, yes, but I was also perhaps reclaiming a world that had been mine by birthright all along. The man waiting with Marco in the mountain house's great room was ancient, his body frail but his eyes sharp and alert as they tracked my entrance. He sat in a leather armchair by the fireplace, a heavy wool blanket across his knees, despite the room's comfortable temperature. As I approached, he straightened slightly, his gaze locked on the pendant at my throat. "Madonna mia," he whispered, crossing himself. "It's like seeing a ghost." Marco stood beside the old man's chair, his hand resting lightly on the aged shoulder. "Amber, this is Tommaso Ferretti. He was my father's consigliere for 30 years, and before that he served your grandfather in the same capacity." Tommaso extended a gnarled hand, and when I took it, his grip was surprisingly strong. "You have his eyes," he said in heavily accented English. Antonio's eyes, green like the hills of Sicily in spring. I sat in the chair opposite him, hyper-aware of Marco, watching our interaction with calculated interest. "You knew my grandfather well? Since we were boys together," Tommaso confirmed, releasing my hand with reluctance. "I served him until—" He glanced at Marco, something unspoken passing between them. "Until circumstances forced choices. Until my grandfather was murdered, and you switched your loyalty to his killer," I said bluntly. Marco tensed, but Tommaso merely nodded, accepting the accusation without defense. In our world, survival often demands uncomfortable compromises. I had a family to protect. And did that protection extend to my grandmother and her baby, my mother? Or were they just acceptable casualties? The old man's expression crumpled with genuine remorse. Rose's escape was facilitated, not by me directly, but through channels I ensured remained open. His roomy eyes held mine. Antonio was like a brother to me. I could not save him, but I could honor him by preserving his bloodline. Something in his phrasing caught my attention. "Could not save him? You mean you knew what was going to happen?" Tommaso glanced at Marco again, who gave an almost imperceptible nod. "I knew Salvatore had been convinced of Antonio's betrayal," Tommaso said carefully. "What I did not know until too late was who had planted that conviction and why." "The Castellanos," I supplied, remembering what Marco had told me. "Specifically, Vittorio's grandfather Enzo," Marco interjected. "A master manipulator who saw opportunity in turning allies against each other." Tommaso nodded. "Enzo created elaborate evidence, doctored photographs, falsified financial records, paid witnesses. By the time I discovered the deception, Antonio was already dead and Rosa fled with the child. And Salvatore Valenti, Marco's father? Did he ever face consequences for murdering an innocent man? For making my grandmother a widow and my mother an orphan? The question hung in the air, heavy with accusation. Marco's expression hardened, but he didn't interrupt. Salvatore paid with his sanity, Tommaso replied softly. When he learned the truth years later, that he had murdered his closest friend based on lies, the old man shook his head. Something broke in him. He spent his final years searching for Rosa and the child, desperate for forgiveness he knew he'd never deserve. Convenient that his guilt only manifested after it was too late to make amends, I observed coldly. Marco moved then, coming to stand behind my chair, his presence a palpable force. My father was a complex man with blood on his hands, he said, his voice tight with controlled emotion. I make no excuses for his actions, but his remorse was genuine, as is my desire to right historical wrongs. By finding me, I concluded. By bringing Antonio Marino's granddaughter back into the fold. By giving you the choice my father denied your mother, Marco corrected. The choice to know your heritage and decide what to do with it. Tommaso leaned forward, his eyes suddenly more alert. The Marino pendant you wear, have you discovered its secret yet? I touched it reflexively. Secret? The old man's smile was enigmatic. Antonio was always cautious, always preparing for betrayal, even from those closest to him. That pendant wasn't just a symbol of family connection. It contained something valuable. Marco's hand came to rest on my shoulder, his touch both possessive and protective. We believe your grandfather hid proof of his innocence and evidence of who really betrayed the organization inside the 3 family pendants. Insurance, in case the worst happened. Which it did, I said quietly. Yes. Marco's fingers tightened slightly on my shoulder. My father found nothing in Antonio's pendant, which he took after that night. The 3rd was to be given to your mother when she came of age, but it remained in a vault when Rosa fled with her. So mine is the only one that might contain this evidence, I concluded. Tommaso nodded. And Vittorio Castellano knows it. Why do you think he was so interested in you at the hotel? Why he's been watching your apartment? The Castellanos have maintained power for decades based on the lie that Antonio Marino was a traitor. If proof emerged now, their position would be compromised, Marco finished. And the alliance they've built with several former Marino territories would crumble. The weight of the pendant suddenly felt heavier against my skin. Not just a family heirloom, but potentially evidence that could upend power structures that had existed for decades. No wonder Vittorio had looked at it so hungrily. How would I even find this proof? I've worn this pendant for months and never noticed anything unusual. Antonio was clever, Tommaso said. The mechanism would only be apparent to someone who knew what to look for. Marco's hand slid from my shoulder to the back of my neck, his touch sending an involuntary shiver down my spine. Which is why I've arranged for an expert to examine it tomorrow. Someone who specializes in such hidden compartments. The casual intimacy of his touch was disarming a deliberate tactic, I suspected. Since arriving at the mountain house, Marco's behavior toward me had shifted subtly. The careful distance he'd maintained was diminishing, replaced by these small points of contact that seemed designed to acclimate me to his presence. His touch. More disturbing was how much I welcomed it. I'm tired, I said abruptly, standing to break the contact. It's been an overwhelming few days. Tommaso nodded in understanding, but his eyes were shrewd as they moved between Marco and me. Of course, child. Rest. Tomorrow will bring its own challenges. As I turned to leave, the old man caught my wrist. One more thing, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Trust carefully in this world you've entered. Even those with honorable intentions can be dangerous when power and blood intersect. His gaze flicked briefly to Marco. So quickly I almost missed it. Everyone has secrets, little lion, he added, using a nickname that made my breath catch. My grandmother had called me that as a child. Even those who claimed to be revealing them to you. I retreated to my suite, mind racing with implications. Marco had shown me photographs, documentation, brought me to Tommaso, all seemingly to help me understand my heritage. Yet Tommaso's warning suggested there were still pieces of the puzzle being withheld. The nagging suspicion that had been growing since the hotel confrontation with Vittorio crystallized into something more concrete. Marco was playing a long game, one in which I was a crucial piece. But was I a pawn to be sacrificed or a queen to be protected? And what would happen when he discovered I was developing my own agenda in this deadly chess match? As I stood on the balcony overlooking the darkening mountains, I felt Marco's presence before I heard him. He moved silently for such a powerfully built man. Tommaso has always had a flair for the dramatic, he said, joining me at the railing. His warning was unnecessary. Was it? I turned to face him. You've been forthcoming about my grandfather, about your father's role in his death, but I can't shake the feeling that you're still holding something back. In the fading light, Marco's eyes were unreadable. Everyone holds something back, Amber. Survival depends on it. He stepped closer, eliminating the careful distance he'd maintained until now. His hand came up to touch the pendant at my throat, his fingers brushing my collarbone in a way that made my pulse quicken despite my wariness. But I promise you this, he continued, his voice dropping to a register that seemed to vibrate through my entire body. Whatever secrets remain between us, they don't change my fundamental purpose, to protect what's mine. I'm not yours, I said, the protest sounding weak even to my own ears. Marco's smile was predatory, confident. Not yet, he agreed. But you will be. It's inevitable, written in blood decades before either of us was born. His certainty should have repelled me. Instead, it awakened something primal, something that recognized the dangerous attraction of power entwined with desire. I stepped back, needing distance from his magnetic pull. Good night, Marco. His eyes gleamed in the gathering darkness. Sleep well, little lion, he replied, using Tommaso's nickname with deliberate intimacy. Tomorrow we begin to unravel the mystery your grandfather left behind, and with it, perhaps, your future. Long after he'd gone, I remained on the balcony, torn between growing suspicion and undeniable attraction. Marco Valenti was manipulative, dangerous, and potentially still hiding crucial truths. Yet with every revelation, every careful touch, he was drawing me deeper into his world, a world that might have been mine by birthright, had history unfolded differently. The real question was whether I could navigate this treacherous terrain without losing myself completely to its seductive power or to the man who commanded it with such devastating skill. Dawn broke over the Alps, painting the snow-capped peaks in hues of gold and rose that would have been breathtaking under different circumstances. Instead, I watched the sunrise from the window of Marco's private jet, my thoughts as turbulent as the clouds we cut through. The decision to leave Austria had come suddenly, with Marco appearing at my door shortly after midnight, his expression grave. We need to move. Now. His tone had brooked no argument. Vittorio's men have been spotted in the village below. We're flying to Italy within the hour. Now, watching the landscape change from alpine forests to the Mediterranean coastline, I cradled the pendant between my fingers, its weight both familiar and strange. The expert Marco had mentioned an elderly jeweler with connections to both our families had been waiting at the private airfield, examining the pendant for mere minutes before confirming Tommaso's claim. There is indeed a concealed compartment, he'd explained, his magnifying glass revealing nearly invisible seams in the gold work, but it appears to have been designed to open only when combined with the other two pendants, a three-part key, if you will, which explained our current journey to Marco's ancestral home in Sicily, where his father's pendant taken from my grandfather's body remained secured in the family vault. What about the third pendant, I'd asked. The one meant for my mother? In a safe deposit box in Rome, Marco had replied. Isabella is retrieving it now. She'll meet us in Sicily. I glanced across the luxurious cabin to where Marco sat reviewing documents, his profile sharp against the window. He'd been uncharacteristically silent since our departure, his earlier intensity replaced by a focused concentration that seemed to exclude everything, including me. You still haven't told me what you expect to find, I said, breaking the silence. What evidence could my grandfather possibly have hidden that would matter after all these years? Marco looked up, his golden eyes assessing. Antonio Marino was methodical. If he suspected betrayal was coming, and we have reason to believe he did, he would have documented who was working against him and how. Names, dates, financial transactions. Information that could dismantle the Castellano power base, I concluded, and potentially restore what rightfully belongs to the Marino line. His gaze was steady. To you. The implication hung between us that I could claim territories, businesses, loyalty networks that had once answered to my grandfather, that I could step into a role I'd never known existed, never trained for. I'm a culinary student, Marco, not a whatever you're suggesting. His smile was slight but genuine. Your grandmother was 19 when she became Antonio's wife and partner. Within 3 years, she was helping manage an organization that spanned half of Sicily. He set aside his documents. Blood finds its level, Amber. The Marino instinct for power doesn't require training, just opportunity. The casual confidence with which he discussed criminal enterprise should have horrified me. Instead, I felt that same forbidden thrill I'd experienced at the mountain house, a sense of possibility beyond the narrow constraints of the life I'd thought was mine. Our arrival in Sicily brought another shift in atmosphere. As we descended from the plane onto a private airstrip surrounded by olive groves, I felt Marco's security posture tighten, his body subtly positioning itself between me and potential threat vectors. Paolo and 3 other men I hadn't seen before formed a loose perimeter as we moved toward waiting vehicles. "Welcome to Valenti territory," Marco murmured, his hand at the small of my back guiding me toward a sleek black SUV. "It's been contested since my father's death. My presence here makes a statement." "And my presence?" I asked, acutely aware of the guard's eyes tracking my movements, lingering on the pendant visible at my throat. Marco's hand tightened slightly against my back. "Makes an even stronger one." The drive took us along coastal roads and then inland, winding through hills dotted with cypress trees and ancient stone structures. After nearly an hour, we turned onto a private drive flanked by iron gates bearing the now familiar Valenti crest, similar to my pendant's design but with subtle differences that marked territorial boundaries as clearly as any modern logo. The estate that emerged at the end of the cypress-lined drive stole my breath. Not a house, but a compound centered around what appeared to be a restored medieval fortress. Stone walls rose imposingly from manicured grounds, while more modern structures had been integrated with surprising architectural harmony. The effect was both beautiful and intimidating, a perfect physical manifestation of the Valenti approach to power. "This has been in my family for 12 generations, Marco said, watching my reaction. "Though it's undergone significant renovations since its origins as a defensive position against coastal raiders, it still looks pretty defensive to me," I observed, noting the subtle security features, cameras disguised as architectural elements, strategic positioning that allowed no approach without visibility, the height advantage of the main structure. Marco's laugh was unexpected and warm. "You have a good eye, perhaps more of your grandfather in you than you realize." Inside, the fortress revealed surprising warmth, stone walls softened by tapestries, modern comforts integrated seamlessly with historical elements, soaring ceilings that admitted Mediterranean light through strategically placed windows. Staff appeared and disappeared with practiced efficiency, their deference to Marco absolute, but their curious glances at me unmistakable. "Your rooms are in the east wing," Marco explained, leading me through a series of corridors that would have been labyrinthine without a guide. "It has the best views of the coastline, and the most defensible position," I added, noting the strategic layout that would make the east wing the final retreat in case of attack. Again that flash of approval in his eyes. "You catch on quickly." The suite he showed me to was elegant, without being ostentatious, a spacious bedroom with a canopied bed, a sitting area with antique furniture that somehow avoided feeling museum-like, a modern bathroom discreetly integrated into the historical structure, and a private terrace overlooking the distant Mediterranean. "This was my mother's favorite room," Marco said, something vulnerable briefly crossing his features before disappearing behind his usual controlled mask. "I thought you might appreciate it." The personal connection surprised me. It was the first time he'd mentioned his mother or shown any sentiment about his family beyond strategic considerations. "Thank you," I said simply. He nodded, moving toward the door. "Rest. Change. When you're ready, come to the library on the main floor. There are things you should see before Isabella arrives with the 3rd pendant." Alone, I explored the suite more thoroughly, running my fingers over the spines of books on bedside tables, examining the artwork that adorned the walls, all landscapes of Sicily, some modern, others clearly centuries old. In the closet, I found clothing in my size, much like at the mountain house. But these pieces seemed different, less contemporary designer fashion, more timeless elegance with subtle vintage elements. I changed into a simple black dress from the selection, keeping my pendant visible at my throat. Whatever Marco wanted to show me in the library, I sensed it would be another piece in the puzzle of my grandfather's death and potentially another layer of Marco's carefully orchestrated revelation of my heritage. Finding the library proved challenging in the sprawling fortress, but eventually, I located it in the central building, a 2-story room with walls of leather-bound volumes, rolling ladders to access upper shelves, and a massive stone fireplace at one end. The space was empty when I entered, giving me a chance to explore freely. One wall caught my attention, immediately covered, not with books but with framed photographs documenting what appeared to be Valenti family history. I moved closer, scanning faces across decades, noting the gradual evolution from formal portraits to more casual family groupings. And then I saw it. A photograph that made my blood run cold. My grandfather, unmistakably Antonio Marino, from the photos Marco had shown me, standing beside a younger version of Tommaso, and a man who could only be Marco's father, Salvatore Valenti. They were laughing, arms around each other's shoulders, clearly close friends. But what made my hand fly to my mouth was the fourth person in the image. My grandmother, young and beautiful, gazing not at my grandfather, but at Salvatore Valenti, with an expression I recognized instantly. Desire, longing, love. "I see you've found it." Marco's voice came from behind me, making me start. He moved to stand beside me, his eyes on the photograph. The image my father couldn't bring himself to destroy, even after everything that happened. "My grandmother and your father." I couldn't finish the sentence, the implications too staggering. "Were lovers," Marco confirmed, his voice carefully neutral. "Before she married Antonio, and according to some accounts, after as well." The room seemed to tilt around me. "Are you suggesting that your mother might have been Salvatore Valenti's child, not Antonio Marino's?" Marco turned to face me fully. It was the question that drove my father to madness in his final years. The possibility that he had not only murdered his friend based on false evidence, but potentially killed the father of his own child. I stepped back, needing distance from both Marco and the photograph that challenged everything I thought I knew. Why show me this now? Why not tell me at the hotel, or the mountain house? "Would you have believed me without seeing the evidence with your own eyes?" Marco asked. "Or would you have assumed it was another manipulation?" He had a point, but the revelation felt like a betrayal not just of my grandfather by my grandmother, but of me by Marco. He'd been carefully controlling what I learned and when, revealing only enough to keep me moving in the direction he wanted. "What else are you hiding?" I demanded. "What other bombshells are waiting to be dropped at strategically timed intervals?" Marco's expression hardened. "I'm trying to protect you from the full weight of this history landing on you at once." "No," I shot back, anger rising. "You're controlling me, feeding me pieces of a story to ensure I react exactly as you want, to ensure I become exactly what you need, a Marino heir willing to align with Valenti interests." His eyes flashed dangerously, but before he could respond, the library door opened to admit Isabella, looking travel-worn but elegant as always. She stopped short, sensing the tension in the room. "Am I interrupting?" she asked, her sharp gaze moving between us. Marco composed himself with visible effort. "Not at all. Did you secure the pendant?" Isabella nodded, withdrawing a small velvet pouch from her handbag. It was exactly where Father's notes indicated. Her eyes fell on the photograph still displayed on the wall, and something like regret crossed her features. "I see you've shown her. Some truths can't be hidden forever," Marco replied, extending his hand for the pouch. Instead, Isabella moved toward me, offering it directly. "This belongs to the Marino line," she said formally. "To you, by right of blood, whatever that blood may truly be." I accepted the pouch, our eyes meeting in a moment of wordless communication. There was warning in Isabella's gaze, but also something like sympathy. She knew what it meant to discover your family history was built on lies. She'd navigated those same waters after her father's death. As I opened the pouch to reveal the third pendant, identical to mine but newer, unworn, the weight of legacy and deception pressed down on me like a physical force. Was I Antonio Marino's granddaughter, heir to a stolen empire? Or was I Salvatore Valenti's granddaughter, with a claim to both bloodlines and their complicated, violent history? And Marco, was he my cousin, my enemy, the man orchestrating my entry into a world of power and danger for his own purposes? Or something else entirely, something more dangerous because of the undeniable attraction that pulled between us despite every revelation and betrayal? "Now," Marco said, his voice breaking into my thoughts, "we can finally discover what Antonio Marino hid all those years ago, and who truly engineered his death." The 3 pendants lay on the library table, catching the late afternoon sun that streamed through the tall windows. Mine, worn and patinated with age and constant contact with my skin. My grandfather's, taken from his body by Salvatore Valenti, its gold unmarred but somehow colder. And the third, intended for my mother, pristine in its decades of vault storage. Together they form a key, Marco explained, arranging them in a triangular pattern. According to my father's notes, when properly aligned, the mechanisms should release simultaneously. Isabella stood slightly apart, her arms crossed, watching with a detachment that seemed practiced. Father became obsessed with these in his final years. He was convinced they contained proof that would exonerate him or condemn him beyond redemption. "And you?" I asked her. "What do you believe?" Her eyes met mine, cool and assessing. "I believe history rarely offers the clean resolutions we crave." Marco aligned the pendants carefully, their lion motifs now forming a complete circle. Nothing happened. "Perhaps there's a specific orientation," he murmured, rotating the arrangement slightly. Still nothing. "Let me," I said suddenly, moved by instinct rather than knowledge. I rearranged the pendants, placing mine at the top of the triangle. My grandmother always wore hers, with the lion's head pointing up, not down. As I completed the alignment, a faint click emanated from all three pieces simultaneously. The centers of the pendants released, revealing tiny compartments within each. From my grandfather's pendant, Marco extracted a microfilm container. From my mother's, a small golden key. And from mine, the one my grandmother had worn daily, a folded piece of paper so thin it was nearly translucent. "Remarkable," Isabella breathed, "after all these years." Marco carefully unfolded the paper from my pendant, revealing what appeared to be a cipher key rows of numbers and corresponding letters. He then examined the microfilm container. "This will need special equipment to view." "And the key?" I asked, picking up the tiny golden object from my mother's pendant. "Most likely for a safe deposit box," Marco said. "Location unknown." Isabella moved closer, examining the cipher. "This looks like Antonio's personal code. He used it for sensitive communications." She glanced at me. "Your grandmother would have known it too." "We need to process the microfilm immediately," Marco decided, gathering the items carefully. "Isabella, have Stefano bring the equipment from the secure room." As Isabella left to carry out his instructions, Marco turned to me, his expression more open than I'd seen it yet. "We're close, Amber. Whatever truth your grandfather protected with his life is finally within reach. And if that truth destroys everything you believe about your father, about your family's claim to power," I challenged. His eyes held mine steadily. "Then it still deserves to be known." The microfilm reader arrived, carried by a severe-looking man with military bearing who avoided eye contact with me while setting up the equipment. When he left, Marco carefully loaded the tiny film into the reader, adjusting focus until the images became clear. What appeared were pages of accounting ledgers, transaction records, and what looked like surveillance photographs, all documenting an elaborate conspiracy. Isabella leaned closer, her breath catching as she recognized names and dates. "These are records of payments from Enzo Castellano to someone within Antonio's organization," she said, pointing to recurring transfers. "And here, photographs of meetings that never should have happened." Marco's expression darkened as he advanced through the images. "This confirms what we suspected. Castellano orchestrated Antonio's downfall by bribing someone close to him to plant evidence of betrayal." "But who?" I asked, scanning the documents for a name that might identify the traitor. The answer came in the final image, a photograph of a man handing documents to Enzo Castellano in what appeared to be a secluded garden. The man's face was clearly visible, and though decades younger, I recognized him immediately. "Tommaso," I whispered, the betrayal hitting me like a physical blow. Marco went rigid beside me, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of the table. "Impossible," he said, though his tone suggested he knew otherwise. "He was Antonio's oldest friend, my father's most trusted advisor. The perfect position from which to betray both families," Isabella observed, her voice cold with fury. "Trusted enough to never be suspected, positioned perfectly to influence Salvatore's response when evidence of Antonio's treachery appeared." I thought back to Tommaso's warnings at the mountain house, his cryptic advice to trust carefully. Had he sensed we were close to discovering his role in my grandfather's death? Had his frailty been as calculated as his decades-long deception? "Where is Tommaso now?" I asked, sudden dread washing over me. Marco and Isabella exchanged a sharp glance. "He returned to his villa near Palermo yesterday," Marco said, already reaching for his phone. "Paolo, secure Tommaso Ferretti immediately. No contact with outsiders." He listened briefly before his expression turned to stone. "Find him. Now." "He's gone?" Isabella asked as Marco ended the call. "Left his villa 3 hours ago with a small suitcase. His security detail thought he was joining us here." Marco's control was slipping, anger radiating from him in almost palpable waves. He knew. Somehow he knew we were close to the truth. The jeweler, I realized. He must have contacted Tommaso after examining my pendant. Marco was already issuing orders into his phone, deploying security teams, activating surveillance networks. Isabella moved to a laptop on a side table, fingers flying over the keyboard as she accessed what appeared to be tracking systems. I stood immobile, trying to process the revelation. Tommaso, the man who had spoken so fondly of my grandfather, who had claimed to facilitate my grandmother's escape, had been the architect of Antonio Marino's destruction. Had my grandmother known? Had she worn the pendant all those years, knowing it contained evidence that could bring her husband's true killer to justice? "There's more," Isabella said suddenly, having decrypted the cipher found in my pendant. "This references a recording audio evidence stored in a safe deposit box in Rome. The key we found must open it." "A recording of what?" I asked, moving to read over her shoulder. "According to this, Antonio recorded his final conversation with Salvatore Valenti, the confrontation that ended with his death." Her voice softened with something like sympathy. "He knew he was walking into a trap, Amber. Your grandfather went to that meeting wearing a recording device, knowing Salvatore planned to kill him. The implications staggered me. He sacrificed himself to document the truth, a truth that could only emerge decades later, when you appeared wearing his wife's pendant," Marco added, his eyes meeting mine with newfound intensity. "Your grandmother must have planned this moment, your return to Italy, the revelation of Tommaso's betrayal." A heavy silence fell over the library as we absorbed the magnitude of what we'd discovered. Generations of lies, betrayal, and carefully orchestrated revenge plots that had culminated in this moment, with me standing in the Valenti family home, unraveling mysteries that had claimed lives and destroyed families. Marco broke the silence first. "We need to move quickly. Tommaso will be contacting Vittorio Castellano, if he hasn't already. The recording must be secured before they can reach it." "I'll go to Rome," Isabella offered. "My presence will attract less attention than yours." "No," Marco countered. "We stay together. We fly to Rome tonight, all of us." His gaze fixed on me. "It's time to end this, once and for all." As Isabella left to make arrangements, Marco approached me, his movements deliberate, almost predatory. "Are you beginning to understand now why I've been protecting you since the moment you arrived in Vienna? Why finding you changed everything?" I stepped back, needing distance from his intensity. "You've been manipulating me, Marco, controlling what I learned and when I learned it. Using me to uncover evidence that serves your vendetta against the Castellanos." "Yes," he admitted without hesitation. "And protecting you from those who would kill Antonio Marino's granddaughter without a second thought. Those like Tommaso, who has maintained his position of respect and influence through decades of lies." His honesty was disarming, as was the raw emotion now visible in his usually controlled features. For the first time, I glimpsed the true Marco beneath the calculated facade, a man driven by a complex mixture of guilt, duty, and obsession. "What happens after Rome?" I asked. "After we find this recording and expose Tommaso's betrayal?" Marco's eyes darkened. "Justice," he said simply. "For your grandfather. For my father, who was manipulated into becoming a killer. For your grandmother, who spent decades in exile knowing her husband's murderer remained unpunished. And for me?" I pressed. "What role have you scripted for Antonio Marino's granddaughter once justice is served?" He stepped closer, closing the distance I'd created. "That depends entirely on what you want, Amber. The Marino territories could be restored to your control. You could take your rightful place in a world your grandfather once dominated." His voice lowered. "With the right alliance, your position would be unassailable." "An alliance with you?" I concluded, finally seeing the endgame he'd been working toward. The Valenti and Marino families united, not just through shared history or business interests, but through us. Marco's hand came up to brush my cheek, his touch both gentle and possessive. "We are the future our families should have had, before Tommaso and the Castellanos destroyed everything. Together we could rebuild something unprecedented, legitimate business empire on the surface, with the full power of both family networks supporting it from below." His vision was seductive in its clarity and ambition, but as his hand moved to cup the back of my neck, drawing me closer, a sliver of doubt worked its way through the intoxication of his proximity. Marco Valenti had orchestrated every moment since our chance meeting in Vienna. He had calculated each revelation for maximum impact, manipulated my emotions with surgical precision, all while keeping crucial information hidden until it served his purpose. Could I trust him now, even as his lips descended toward mine with devastating intent? The answer was lost in the consuming heat of his kiss, possessive, demanding, yet with an underlying vulnerability that suggested even Marco Valenti wasn't entirely in control of what burned between us. When we broke apart, both breathing heavily, his eyes had darkened to molten gold. "You're mine," he whispered against my lips. You have been since before you ever set foot in Vienna. Before you were even born. Our family's blood and history ensured we would find each other. The declaration should have frightened me. Instead, it awakened something primal and reckless, a willingness to claim the heritage and power that had been stolen from my family through betrayal and murder. But as I leaned into him, surrendering momentarily to the magnetic pull between us, one question remained unanswered, hovering like a shadow at the edges of my mind. In all the revelations about my grandfather, Tommaso's betrayal, and the Castellanos' manipulation, Marco had carefully avoided addressing the photograph that had started our confrontation, the image showing my grandmother's apparent relationship with his father. What else was Marco Valenti still hiding? And would discovering it destroy whatever dangerous connection was forming between us? Rome greeted us with torrential rain, sheets of water cascading from a leaden sky as our convoy of black SUVs moved through the ancient city's narrow streets. The weather matched my turbulent thoughts, dark, chaotic, threatening to overflow the carefully constructed channels I'd built to contain them. We'd arrived at dawn, Marco having insisted on immediate departure from Sicily once the arrangements were secured. The safe deposit box was located in a private bank near the Spanish Steps, an institution that catered to wealthy families who valued discretion above all else. Marco had made calls during the flight, ensuring access would be granted despite the early hour. Now, as our vehicles pulled to a stop before an unassuming building with a discreet brass plaque as its only identification, I felt Marco's eyes on me from the seat beside mine. Second thoughts? He asked, his voice low enough that Paolo, in the driver's seat, couldn't hear. I met his gaze steadily. About uncovering the truth? No. His smile was subtle but appreciative. And about us? That question was more complicated. Since our kiss in the library, Marco had maintained a careful physical distance while keeping me constantly in his orbit. The tension between us had built throughout the journey, charged and dangerous. One revelation at a time, I replied, earning another of those rare, genuine smiles that transformed his features from coldly handsome to breathtaking. Inside the bank, we were greeted with the deference reserved for those with both wealth and power. Marco's name opened doors that would have remained firmly closed to ordinary clients, particularly at such an hour. Isabella accompanied us, her presence providing a buffer I increasingly needed as Marco's proximity affected my ability to think clearly. The bank manager himself escorted us to the vault, leaving us in a private room with the retrieved safety deposit box, a surprisingly modest metal container for something that had shaped the destinies of two powerful families. The tiny gold key from my mother's pendant fit perfectly, turning with a soft click that seemed to echo in the silent room. Marco lifted the lid, revealing several items. A small recording device, vintage but well-preserved. A sealed envelope with my grandmother's handwriting addressing it to Maria, my daughter, and a leather-bound journal that appeared to be my grandfather's. The evidence Antonio died for, Isabella murmured, her eyes fixed on the recording device. Marco carefully removed it, examining it before looking up at me. This should be your decision, he said, his voice grave. Whether to listen, and who should hear it. The gesture of respect allowing me control over this piece of my family's history felt significant. I nodded, taking the device from his hands. We all hear it, together. The recording quality was poor, distorted by age and the primitive technology of the era, but the voices were clear enough my grandfather's, steady despite what must have been his awareness of impending danger, and another man's agitated and increasingly aggressive. I trusted you, Antonio, like a brother, and you betrayed everything we built together. Salvatore Valenti's voice cracked with emotion that sounded genuine even through decades of magnetic tape. I never betrayed you, Salvatore. My grandfather's calm denial, tinged with resignation. Think, who benefits most if you believe I did? Who has been whispering in your ear, showing you evidence that I could prove false if given the chance? Tommaso showed me the documents himself. The payments to our competitors, the information leaks, the meeting with federal prosecutors, and you never questioned why Tommaso, who has always stood between us, suddenly brings you this evidence when I'm away, when I can't defend myself immediately. A pause, then Salvatore's voice again, uncertain now. What are you saying? I'm saying examine the source. Ask yourself who gains power if you eliminate me. Not you already have my loyalty. Not our shared enemies, they fear our alliance too much. Only someone within. Someone who has always resented being the advisor rather than the leader. The sound of a door opening interrupted the exchange, followed by a third voice, one I recognized from our recent meetings, though decades younger. Salvatore, they're moving on the shipment. We need to. Tommaso's voice cut off abruptly. Antonio, you're back early. What followed was chaos, shouting accusations, the sound of a struggle. Then 3 gunshots in rapid succession, a heavy thud, and my grandmother's voice, screaming my grandfather's name in anguish. The recording continued for several more seconds, footsteps, harsh breathing, and finally Tommaso's voice, quiet and satisfied. It's done. Call Castellano. Tell him Antonio Marino is no longer a concern. The device clicked off, leaving a silence that felt physical in its weight. Marco's face had drained of color, his knuckles white where they gripped the edge of the table. Isabella pressed a hand to her mouth, eyes closed against what we'd just heard. My father was manipulated into pulling the trigger, Marco said finally, his voice rough. But Tommaso orchestrated everything, the false evidence, the timing, even ensuring my father would be armed and primed for violence. And the Castellanos funded it all, Isabella added, collecting herself with visible effort, paying Tommaso to eliminate Antonio and fracture our family's alliance. I reached for the envelope addressed to my mother, needing something to ground me after hearing my grandfather's final moments. The paper was thin with age, the seal brittle as I carefully broke it. My grandmother's elegant handwriting filled several pages, but it was the opening paragraph that stopped my breath. My dearest daughter, by the time you read this, I will likely be gone, and you will have learned truths I've kept from you your entire life. You are not simply Antonio Marino's daughter and heir, you are also Salvatore Valenti's child, conceived in love before politics and family obligations forced me to marry Antonio. Both men knew the truth, and both loved you regardless of blood. Antonio raised you as his own with full knowledge, his love no less genuine for its foundation in choice rather than biology. I lowered the letter, meeting Marco's questioning gaze. My mother was Salvatore's biological daughter, I said, my voice sounding distant to my own ears. Which makes you and I cousins, he finished, something unreadable flashing in his eyes. Though in our world, such connections have never been impediments to alliance. Isabella took the letter from my trembling hands, scanning it quickly. Rosa kept this secret all these years, she murmured. Even from you. My grandmother took many secrets to her grave, I said, reaching for the journal that remained in the box. I wonder what other revelations Antonio Marino left behind. Before I could open it, Marco's phone vibrated. He glanced at the screen, his expression hardening instantly. Tommaso has been located, he said, standing abruptly. In a hotel near the Vatican. Apparently he's meeting with Vittorio Castellano as we speak. The surge of rage that shot through me was unexpected in its intensity pure, clarifying anger at the man who had orchestrated my grandfather's death, manipulated Marco's father into being his weapon, and forced my grandmother into exile. What now? Isabella asked, watching her brother carefully. Marco's eyes met mine, searching for something. Whatever he saw must have satisfied him, because he nodded slightly before answering his sister. Now we confront the architect of everything that was stolen from us. Both families. His gaze remained locked with mine. Together, the drive to the hotel passed in tense silence, the rain having intensified to a biblical downpour that emptied Rome's streets of all but the most determined pedestrians. I sat beside Marco in the back seat, Antonio's journal clutched in my hands like a talisman. I'd begun reading during the drive, discovering detailed accounts of Tommaso's increasingly suspicious activities in the weeks before my grandfather's murder. He knew, I said quietly. My grandfather documented everything's subtle betrayals, inconsistencies in Tommaso's behavior. He suspected but couldn't bring himself to believe his oldest friend would betray him so completely. Marco's hand covered mine, warm and steady. A mistake that cost him his life, and one we won't repeat, I replied, surprising myself with the cold determination in my voice. The hotel was one of Rome's finest, a renovated palazzo that catered to wealthy visitors seeking both luxury and anonymity. Paolo and 2 other security men accompanied us through the ornate lobby, their presence deterring questions from the front desk staff as Marco led us directly to the elevators. Suite 412, he said, checking his phone one last time. Reserved under a name Tommaso has used before when conducting sensitive business. And Vittorio? Isabella asked, her hand resting discreetly on what I suspected was a concealed weapon. Confirmed inside as of 20 minutes ago, Marco replied, his own jacket arranged to allow easy access to whatever he carried beneath it. I should have been frightened by the clear preparations for violence. Instead, I felt a strange calm descend, a cold clarity that seemed to sharpen every sense while dampening all hesitation. We reached the 4th floor, moving silently down the carpeted hallway. At suite 412, Marco paused, listening for a moment before nodding to Paolo, who produced what looked like a key card but clearly wasn't standard issue. The door opened silently, revealing a luxurious suite with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking a rain-lashed view of the Vatican dome in the distance. In the sitting area, two men were deep in conversation: Tommaso, looking considerably less frail than he had at the mountain house, and Vittorio Castellano, elegant as always, in a perfectly tailored suit. They both looked up as our group entered. Startlement quickly replaced by calculation on Vittorio's face, and something like resignation on Tommaso's. "Marco," Vittorio greeted, rising smoothly from his seat. What an unexpected pleasure, and with Antonio Marino's granddaughter no less. How dramatically appropriate. Tommaso remained seated, his eyes fixed on the journal in my hands. "You found it then," he said quietly. "Antonio's final insurance policy." "We found everything," Marco replied, his voice controlled but vibrating with barely contained fury. "The microfilm records of your payments from the Castellanos, the recording of Antonio's murder, Rosa's letter confirming Maria was my father's daughter." Tommaso's eyes widened slightly at the last revelation, but Vittorio merely smiled, looking unsurprised. "So the great family secret is finally revealed," Vittorio said, his tone almost conversational. "The Marino heir is also a Valenti by blood. How wonderfully complicated that makes everything." "It changes nothing about your family's role in destroying both our families," I said, stepping forward. "Or about Tommaso's betrayal." Tommaso sighed heavily, finally looking truly old. "You cannot understand the complexities of that time, child. The pressures, the shifting alliances. I made choices. You chose to orchestrate my grandfather's murder. I cut him off. To manipulate Salvatore Valenti into killing his best friend, and the man raising his biological daughter. There is no justification complex enough to excuse that. And now," Marco said, moving to stand beside me, his shoulder brushing mine in silent solidarity, "you will face the consequences of those choices, both of you." The tension in the room crystallized into something dangerous. Paolo and the security men shifting into defensive positions as Vittorio's hand moved slowly toward his jacket. "I wouldn't," Isabella advised coolly, her own weapon now visible. "This ends today, but how it ends is still negotiable." What happened next occurred with such speed that later, I would struggle to reconstruct the sequence of events. Vittorio lunged not for a weapon but for me, perhaps seeing the Marino heir as his most valuable bargaining chip. Marco moved to intercept him. Paolo's gun appeared, and Tommaso, old, treacherous Tommaso, produced a small pistol from beneath his jacket. "Enough!" he shouted, the weapon wavering between Marco and me. "This has gone on long enough. Decades of secrets and manipulations. It ends now." The gun steadied, pointing directly at me. The last Marino, the last loose end. Marco stepped in front of me instantly, shielding me with his body. "You'll have to go through me first, old man." Tommaso's laugh was bitter. Salvatore's son, protecting Antonio's granddaughter. History does love its ironies. What happened next would haunt my dreams for years to come. The gunshot was deafening in the enclosed space. Marco jerked backward against me, blood blooming on his shoulder. Paolo and the security team returned fire instantly, their reactions trained and automatic. Tommaso collapsed, multiple impacts throwing him back into his chair, his ancient face frozen in a grimace of pain and something that looked almost like relief. Vittorio dove behind a sofa, Isabella's shot missing him by inches. I caught Marco as he staggered, lowering him to the floor while applying pressure to his wound. His eyes remained fixed on mine, alert despite the pain. "Go," he gasped. "Get out, now." "I'm not leaving you," I replied, tearing a strip from my blouse to create a makeshift bandage. Around us, chaos erupted. More security personnel flooded the room. Isabella barked orders, and somewhere in the melee, Vittorio Castellano slipped away like the snake he was. But in that moment, with Marco's blood warm against my hands and his eyes holding mine with fierce intensity, something shifted irrevocably within me. This man, manipulative, dangerous, obsessed with righting historical wrongs, had stepped in front of a bullet meant for me without hesitation. "You're mine," he said through gritted teeth, echoing his earlier declaration. "And I protect what's mine." The possessiveness should have offended me. Instead, it awakened something equally primal in response. A recognition that whatever bond had formed between us, complicated by blood and history though it might be, had become as essential as oxygen. "And you're mine," I whispered back, the words both acknowledgement and promise. The moment crystallized between us, blood and legacy and desire intertwining into something that transcended the chaos surrounding us. something that would shape whatever future emerged from this day of final reckonings and irrevocable choices. The private clinic on the outskirts of Rome resembled a luxury villa more than a medical facility. Nestled among olive groves with views of distant hills, it provided both state-of-the-art treatment and absolute discretion, a combination essential for patients like Marco Valenti, whose gunshot wound would have prompted uncomfortable questions in a conventional hospital. I sat beside his bed in the hushed room, watching the steady rise and fall of his chest as he slept. The bullet had torn through muscle but missed major blood vessels and bone, a fortunate trajectory, according to the surgeon who had extracted it 2 hours earlier. Marco would recover fully, though he would carry another scar to add to the collection I'd glimpsed when they'd cut away his shirt. Isabella entered silently, her normally immaculate appearance showing signs of strain. A loosened strand of hair, the slight wrinkle in her silk blouse, shadows beneath her eyes that makeup couldn't quite conceal. "How is he?" she asked, her voice low. "Stable. The medication is keeping him under for now." I straightened, feeling the ache in my back from hours of sitting vigil. "Any word on Vittorio?" Her expression hardened. "He's gone to ground. Our sources say he crossed into Switzerland 3 hours ago. He won't stay hidden for long," I said, with a certainty that should have disturbed me but somehow didn't. "Not after what happened." Isabella studied me with new intensity. "You've changed," she observed. "Even from yesterday. There's something different in your eyes." I didn't deny it. How could I, when I felt the transformation within myself, a crystallization of purpose, an embracing of aspects of my nature that had lain dormant until awakened by blood and danger? "Watching someone take a bullet meant for you tends to clarify perspective," I said simply. She nodded, accepting this. He wouldn't hesitate to do it again. Marco's protection of those he considers his, absolute. "I've noticed." I glanced at Marco's sleeping form. Though his definition of protection sometimes includes manipulation and calculated revelations. A ghost of a smile touched Isabella's lips. "He's a Valenti. We don't know any other way." She paused, her expression growing more serious. "But he's been more honest with you than I've ever seen him with anyone. More vulnerable, too." Before I could respond, her phone vibrated. She checked it, her posture tensing immediately. "What is it?" I asked. "Paolo has secured Tommaso's personal records from his villa outside Palermo." Her eyes met mine, including detailed documentation of his decades-long relationship with the Castellanos. "He kept evidence of his own betrayal?" "Men like Tommaso always maintain insurance policies." She tucked the phone away. "I need to coordinate the recovery operation. Will you stay with him?" "Yes," I said, though it wasn't really a question. Where else would I go? My previous life, culinary student, anonymous American abroad, felt like a distant dream, as insubstantial as morning fog burned away by harsh sunlight. After Isabella left, I returned to my vigil, mind turning over recent events like puzzle pieces seeking their proper configuration. In a matter of days, I had discovered my true heritage, confronted my grandfather's murderer, learned my mother was the biological daughter of Marco's father, and watched a man I barely knew yet felt inexplicably connected to take a bullet to protect me. Most disturbing was my own reaction to the violence, not horror or revulsion, but a cold, clarifying fury that had focused my mind with laser precision. In that moment, as Tommaso's blood spread across the hotel suite's carpet, I had felt something ancient and primal unfurl within me. The merino instinct for power that Marco had insisted was in my blood. The tour to the Pompidou dolls, the blooded hotel. The realization was still reverberating through me when Marco stirred, his eyes opening slowly, focusing with effort until they found my face. "You're here," he said, his voice rough from anesthesia. "Where else would I be?" I replied, echoing my earlier thought. He attempted to shift position, wincing as the movement pulled at his wound. Halfway to America, perhaps. Away from all of this. His gesture encompassed not just the clinic, but everything that had transpired, the violence, the revelations, the tangled web of family history and obligation. "Running was never really an option, was it?" I asked. "Not since you arranged our accidental meeting in Vienna." A shadow of his usual smile touched his lips. "I underestimated you from the beginning. I expected Rosa Marino's granddaughter to be formidable. But you," he reached for my hand, his grip weak but determined. "You exceed every expectation." "Even knowing I'm Salvatore's granddaughter as well as Antonio's?" I asked, the question that had been hovering between us since the revelation in Rome. His eyes held mine steadily. "Especially knowing that. You are the living embodiment of what our families should have been united, not divided by Tommaso's treachery." "That makes me a convenient symbol," I observed. The perfect solution to decades of misplaced guilt and fractured power structures. Is that what you think this is? Marco's voice sharpened, some of his usual intensity returning despite his weakened state. A strategic calculation? Isn't it? I challenged. You've orchestrated every step since Vienna, controlled what I learned and when I learned it, positioned me precisely where you needed me to be. Yes, he admitted without hesitation. Initially, that was exactly my intention. Find Antonio's heir. Use you to uncover the truth about my father's manipulation. Restore what was stolen from both our families. His grip on my hand tightened. But something changed. You changed it. When? His smile was unexpectedly vulnerable. In the cafe, when you defended your pastries with such fierce pride. In Vienna, when you faced revelations that would have broken most people with remarkable composure. In Sicily, when you instinctively understood the security implications of the East Wing placement. He paused, his golden eyes holding mine. In Rome, when you didn't flinch as Tommaso fell. The assessment was unnervingly accurate. And what did these moments tell you? That you are neither a pawn nor merely a symbol. You're a Marino and a Valenti to your core. You belong in this world, not despite your nature, but because of it. The words resonated with something that had been coalescing within me since discovering my heritage, a sense of recognition, of pieces falling into place. The pendant I still wore seemed to grow warmer against my skin. And if I choose to claim that heritage, I asked, to step fully into both the Marino legacy and whatever this is between us, then the future reshapes itself, Marco replied, his voice gaining strength. The Valenti-Marino alliance reborn, stronger than before because it flows through us both. The territories reclaimed, the businesses legitimized, the power structures reinforced. His eyes darkened, and Vittorio Castellano destroyed for his family's role in everything that was taken from us. The vision he painted was seductive in its clarity and purpose. But something still held me back. A final hesitation before fully committing to this new identity and all it entailed. You took a bullet for me, I said quietly. Why? The question seemed to surprise him. Instinct, he replied after a moment. There was no calculation, no strategic assessment, only the absolute certainty that I could not allow you to be harmed. It was perhaps the most honest thing he'd said to me, an admission of the irrational emotional core beneath his carefully controlled exterior. In that moment of crisis, he had acted not as the strategic head of the Valenti family, but simply as a man protecting someone vital to him. I need time, I said finally. Not to decide whether to embrace my heritage, that decision feels already made, but to determine the terms on which I do so. Marco studied me, understanding dawning in his eyes. You want guarantees, boundaries, equal partnership rather than absorption into the Valenti structure. Yes. I met his gaze steadily. I am Antonio Marino's granddaughter as well as Salvatore Valenti's. Both legacies are mine to claim, and I won't have one subsumed by the other. Instead of resistance, I saw respect and something like admiration in his expression. Your grandfather would be proud, he said softly. He never yielded control, even as an ally. And you? Can you accept partnership with a woman who has been awake to her heritage for mere days, while you've spent a lifetime in this world? Marco's laugh was unexpected, though it ended in a wince as the movement jarred his wounded shoulder. Accept it? Amber, it's precisely what I've wanted since I discovered your existence. His expression grew serious again. But there is one condition I won't negotiate, which is, his free hand came up to touch my cheek, the gesture possessive yet tender. Vittorio Castellano must pay for his family's crimes against both our bloodlines. For Tommaso's betrayal that his grandfather funded. For the bullet that nearly took you from me before we'd even begun. The cold fury I'd felt in the hotel suite returned, sharpening my thoughts to crystal clarity. On that point, I said, covering his hand with mine, we are in perfect agreement. A decision point had been reached, not just about claiming my heritage or accepting the complex connection with Marco, but about embracing the darker aspects of the world I was entering. A world where justice came not through courts and legal systems, but through power and calculated retribution. Then we are decided, Marco said, his eyes holding mine with an intensity that made my breath catch. Partners in all things, equals in purpose and power. Equals, I echoed, sealing the agreement with a word that was both promise and challenge. As I leaned down to seal our pact with a kiss that held both tenderness and dangerous intent, I felt the final pieces of my former self fall away. Amber Riley, ordinary culinary student, receded like a tide pulling back from shore. In her place stood Antonio Marino's granddaughter, Salvatore Valenti's blood, a woman awakening to both heritage and potential, and to the man whose bullet wound proved his devotion more eloquently than any words could have done. The decision had been made. Now would come the consequences for myself, for Marco, and most certainly for Vittorio Castellano, who had no idea that the full combined force of the Valenti and Marino legacies was about to descend upon him like divine retribution. The Swiss chalet perched on a mountainside above Lake Lucerne, its picture-perfect exterior belying the tension that filled its luxurious interior. Through floor-to-ceiling windows, I watched fresh snow dusting the pines, the pristine whiteness contrasting sharply with the darkness of the plans being formed inside. 3 weeks had passed since Rome, since Tommaso's blood had stained hotel carpet and Marco had taken a bullet meant for me. 3 weeks of recovery, strategy, and the systematic dismantling of protective structures Vittorio Castellano had spent decades building. Marco stood at a large table in the chalet's great room, his wounded arm now free of its sling, though he still favored it slightly. Around him gathered key figures from both the Valenti and, surprisingly, the Marino organizations. Old men who had served my grandfather, who had transferred their allegiance to the Valentis after his death, now looked at me with a mixture of wonder and cautious hope. Vittorio's financial channels have been compromised, reported a severe-looking man I'd come to know as Ricci, the Valentis' financial strategist. The offshore accounts Isabella identified have been frozen or redirected. His liquidity is reduced by approximately 60%. Marco nodded, his expression coldly satisfied. And the regulatory investigations? Proceeding as arranged, Isabella replied from her position near the windows. The documents from Tommaso's archives provided everything needed to trigger 3 separate agencies' involvement. The Castellano shipping operations in Marseille and Barcelona have been suspended pending investigation. I listened without comment, still adjusting to this world of strategic destruction, financial, legal, and otherwise. In the weeks since my decision in the Rome clinic, I had immersed myself in learning the structures and operations of both family organizations. Marco had been true to his word about partnership, insisting I participate in every meeting, every decision, every step of the campaign against Vittorio. He's isolated but not neutralized, Marco observed, studying the documents spread across the table. The core Castellano territories remain loyal, and he retains enough resources to be dangerous. Which is why we must strike decisively, said Conte, an elderly man who had once been my grandfather's security chief. The longer we allow him sanctuary in Switzerland, the more time he has to regroup. All eyes turned to me, and I realized they were waiting for my input not out of courtesy but genuine interest in my assessment. The novelty of such deference from men who had spent decades in this world still startled me occasionally. Vittorio expects a direct assault, I said, moving to stand beside Marco at the table. Financial, legal, perhaps even physical. He's prepared for those approaches, because they're what he himself would choose. Marco's eyes met mine, a flash of appreciation in their golden depths. You're suggesting an indirect strategy. I nodded. Vittorio's power has always derived from perception, the belief that his family's influence is untouchable. We've begun eroding that perception, but we need to accelerate its collapse. How? Isabella asked, her sharp mind already anticipating my direction. By offering safety to those who abandon him first, I explained. Specifically, his younger brother Lorenzo, who has always resented Vittorio's control of the family. The suggestion caused a ripple of murmurs around the table. Marco's expression remained impassive, but I caught the slight lift of his eyebrow that indicated surprise and approval. Lorenzo Castellano has been carefully excluded from Vittorio's inner circle, Isabella noted, already typing on her tablet. Recent intelligence suggests tension between them has increased. Make the approach through Lorenzo's wife, I suggested. Sofia comes from the Bianchi family. They were allied with my grandfather before his death. There may be residual loyalty we can leverage. Marco's hand came to rest at the small of my back, the casual possessiveness of the gesture no longer something I resisted but rather welcomed. Elegant, he murmured, for my ears alone. Divide the Castellanos from within while continuing external pressure. The meeting continued, strategy refining into tactical plans, responsibilities assigned, timelines established. Throughout, I remained hyper-aware of Marco beside me, our bodies not quite touching but attuned to each other's movements with an almost preternatural sensitivity. As the gathering dispersed, he guided me onto the chalet's stone terrace despite the cold. Snowflakes melted in his dark hair as he turned to face me, his expression more open than he allowed others to see. You continue to surprise me, he said, a smile touching his lips. Lorenzo Castellano is the perfect pressure point, one I overlooked entirely. You were focused on direct confrontation, I replied. Sometimes oblique approaches achieve more lasting results. The Marino touch. His smile deepened. Your grandfather was known for such strategies, creating divisions among enemies that did his work for him. My grandmother, actually, I corrected. According to Conte, she was the true strategist behind many of Antonio's most successful maneuvers. Marco's hands came up to frame my face, his touch warm against my skin, chilled by the mountain air. Rosa's granddaughter, indeed, he murmured, before claiming my mouth in a kiss that started gentle but quickly intensified, becoming something hungry and demanding. When we broke apart, his eyes had darkened to burnished gold. We will destroy him, Amber. Together. And from the ruins, build something neither the Valentis nor Marinos could have achieved alone. The promise resonated through me, awakening both ambition and desire in equal measure. 3 weeks ago, such naked power hunger would have disturbed me. Now, I recognized it as part of my inheritance. The Marino legacy of strategic brilliance, combined with the Valenti drive for dominance. Yes, I agreed simply, sealing the vow with another kiss, even as snow continued to fall around us, blanketing the world in deceptive purity. Within the week, our strategy began yielding results. Lorenzo Castellano, approached through carefully established channels, revealed himself eager to emerge from his brother's shadow. The information he provided, account details, connection points, security vulnerabilities, accelerated our campaign beyond most optimistic projections. Vittorio's response was predictably violent but ineffective. 2 attempted assaults on Valenti properties were thwarted by security measures I had helped design, incorporating both traditional protocols and unexpected elements that reflected my outsider perspective. He's growing desperate, Marco observed one evening as we reviewed reports of Vittorio's increasingly erratic decisions, lashing out without strategic coherence. Which makes him more dangerous in the short term, I cautioned. Cornered animals are unpredictable. Marco's hand found mine across the table, his thumb tracing circles on my palm in a gesture that had become familiar. All the more reason to end this quickly. The opportunity came 3 days later. Intelligence confirmed Vittorio had left his Swiss sanctuary, traveling to Milan for a meeting with his few remaining allies, a desperate attempt to shore up crumbling support. It's time, Marco said simply, making the call that activated the final phase of our plan. What followed unfolded with the precision of a carefully orchestrated symphony. Financial assets frozen simultaneously across multiple jurisdictions. Regulatory raids on Castellano businesses in 3 countries. Key allies arrested on charges supported by evidence from Tommaso's archives. And finally, Vittorio himself, intercepted not by our people but by Italian financial police acting on information. We had strategically leaked a masterful touch suggested by Isabella that ensured our hands remained technically clean even as our influence directed every aspect of his downfall. The news reached us at the chalet. Vittorio Castellano in custody, his empire collapsing around him, his brother Lorenzo already positioning himself as the reasonable alternative to lead what remained of the family interests. Marco received the confirmation call in the chalet's study, his expression betraying nothing until he ended the conversation and turned to where I waited. It's done, he said simply. Vittorio Castellano has fallen. The external conflict that had shaped both our families for generations had been resolved, not through blood and bullets as in the past, but through a strategic campaign that reflected both our influences. The Marino precision, the Valenti persistence, united in purpose and execution. As Marco drew me into his arms, his lips finding mine in a kiss that tasted of triumph and promise, I understood that we had passed a critical threshold. With our shared enemy neutralized, the true test of our partnership, and whatever existed between us beyond strategic alliance, was about to begin. The Sicilian coast shimmered under the late afternoon sun, waves breaking gently against the rocky shoreline below the terrace where I stood. Behind me, the restored Marino villa, a wedding gift from Marco, hummed with activity as staff prepared for the evening's gathering. 1 year had passed since Vittorio Castellano's fall. 1 year of rebuilding, restructuring, and redefining the intersecting worlds of the Valenti and Marino families. What had once been separate empires divided by betrayal and blood had transformed into an integrated network under our joint leadership, with Marco overseeing the broader Valenti interests while I revitalized operations in traditional Marino territories. The merger had not been without challenges. Old loyalists on both sides had initially resisted the new order, comfortable with familiar boundaries and suspicious of change. But as our vision took tangible form, legitimate businesses flourishing, historical tensions resolved, prosperity returning to regions neglected during decades of fractured leadership, resistance had gradually given way to cautious acceptance, then active support. I heard Marco's footsteps before. I felt his arms encircle me from behind, his hands coming to rest on the slight swell of my abdomen. Our child, 4 months along, the ultimate symbol of our family's unification. "Contemplating your kingdom?" he murmured, his lips brushing my temple. "Our kingdom," I corrected, leaning back against his solid warmth, though I was actually thinking about my grandmother. "Rosa would be proud," Marco said with certainty, "of everything you've accomplished, of the woman you've become." I wasn't so sure. The Amber Riley, my grandmother, had raised the culinary student with ordinary ambitions, and no knowledge of her heritage had vanished completely. In her place stood someone both harder and more powerful, a woman who had embraced aspects of her nature that my grandmother had deliberately kept dormant. "She wanted to protect me from this world," I reminded him. "She fled Italy to ensure I would never have to make the choices she did." Marco turned me gently to face him, his golden eyes serious. "She fled because she had no power to shape that world." "You do." His hand came up to touch the pendant I still wore now, joined by a second, my mother's, forming a matched set that symbolized both my dual heritage and the reunification of our families. "Rosa wanted you safe. You are safer now, with your birthright reclaimed and the power to protect what's yours, than you ever would have been living in ignorance." There was truth in his assessment. The pendant that had once marked me as a target now identified me as someone untouchable, the living embodiment of the restored Valenti-Marino alliance, wife to Marco, the mother of the child who would inherit leadership of both lineages. "You're brooding," Marco observed, his thumb tracing the furrow between my brows. Not ideal before tonight's announcement. The gathering this evening would formalize what our closest associates already knew, that the Valenti and Marino interests were now permanently united through marriage and succession, with our child representing the future of both families. "Not brooding," I corrected, reflecting on how completely life can transform in a single year. Marco's smile held the predatory edge that still sent heat coursing through me despite our months together. "From the moment I saw you in that cafe, I knew your transformation was inevitable. The Marino blood could not remain dormant forever. You orchestrated quite the awakening," I acknowledged, my fingers tracing the scar on his shoulder, the permanent reminder of the bullet he'd taken for me in Rome. "I merely provided opportunity," he countered. "You chose to embrace it, to claim what was always rightfully yours." Including him, though, that had been less calculation and more inevitability, a magnetic pull neither of us had fought very hard against once the initial barriers of suspicion and manipulation had fallen. The sound of a helicopter approaching interrupted our moment of quiet intimacy. Isabella arriving with the documentation we would sign this evening, formalizing the legal structures that would support our unified empire for generations to come. "Ready?" Marco asked, his eyes searching mine for any hesitation. I touched the pendants at my throat, these symbols of a heritage both bloody and powerful, then placed my hand over our growing child, the future born from past tragedy and present strength. "Yes," I replied with the certainty that had become my hallmark in this new life. "I'm exactly where I'm meant to be." As we turned to re-enter the villa, the setting sun cast our joined shadows across the terrace, a single elongated silhouette, rather than separate forms. It seemed an apt metaphor for what we had created. Distinct identities merged into something new and formidable, our individual strengths amplifying rather than competing. When Isabella's helicopter landed minutes later, we greeted her together, the united front that had transformed decades of conflict into a new dynasty. Her approving smile as she noted my hand, protectively cradling my abdomen, confirmed what I already knew. The child growing within me represented more than personal joy. It embodied the restoration of what should have been had Tommaso's betrayal, and the Castellanos' manipulation not fractured what was meant to remain whole. That evening, surrounded by the power brokers of both families, I stood beside Marco as he raised a glass to formalize our announcement. In his tailored suit, with the subtle power of his presence commanding the room, he was every inch the heir to Salvatore Valenti's legacy. Yet the hand that held mine, the eyes that sought my approval before he spoke, belonged to the man who had stepped between me and a bullet without hesitation. The man whose calculated pursuit had transformed into something neither of us had anticipated when he orchestrated our chance meeting in Vienna. "To family," he said simply, the words carrying weight beyond their brevity. "Restored, renewed, reborn. As glasses rose around the room, I felt the full circle of my journey complete. I had entered this world unwittingly, wearing my grandmother's pendant without understanding its significance. Now I wore it as a conscious choice, embracing both the power and responsibility it represented. The pendant that had once been a target on my throat was now a crown, and like all crowns, it carried weight as well as glory. But as Marco's fingers tightened around mine, his golden eyes holding promises both dangerous and exhilarating, I knew with bone-deep certainty that this was precisely where I belonged. It had begun with a mysterious Italian man and a calculated collision in a Viennese cafe. It had continued through revelations, betrayals, and blood. And it would extend into a future neither the Valentis nor Marinos could have built alone, but that we, together, would forge with the same uncompromising strength that had united us in the first place.